Inside the wildlife park, a zookeeper mistreated a baby chimpanzee for a show to entertain the visitors, but he was completely unaware that Shaquille O'Neal was one of the tourists. The vast empty parking lot stretched before Emerald Haven Wildlife Park on a quiet Tuesday morning. A few school buses were parked in their designated area, their yellow paint bright against the asphalt. The large entrance signboard loomed over the mostly vacant lot as Shaquille O'Neal, better known as Shaq, stepped out of his car. He was deliberately dressed down in casual tourist attire, complete with a brown hat to avoid drawing attention. Shaq pressed his phone to his ear, engaging in conversation while locking his car. "Yeah, I'm here now," he said, his deep voice carrying across the empty lot. "I know it's early, but I'm hoping to wrap this up quicker than planned." On the other end of the line, his friend's voice crackled with apology. "I'm sorry about the last-minute invite, Shaq, but you know how rare these reunions are. It's not every day we get all the NBA legends together in one place." Shaq sighed, his footsteps slowing as he approached the entrance. The weight of his dilemma was evident in his voice. I know, it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. That's why I'm trying to move this zoo meeting up, but I made a commitment here first, you know?" His friend's voice softened with understanding. "We get it, big man, just do what you can. It'd mean a lot to have you there, sharing old memories and all." As Shaq neared the entrance, he spotted a staff member waiting by the gate. "Look, I gotta go," he said quickly. "I'll definitely try to make it, all right? Even if I'm late." He ended the call, forcing himself to shift focus to the immediate situation. The staff member's eyes widened in surprise as Shaq approached. "Mr. O'Neal," they stammered, clearly caught off guard. We weren't expecting you for another couple of hours." Shaq offered an apologetic smile. "Yeah, sorry about that. Had a sudden schedule conflict and didn't get a chance to call ahead. Thought I'd try my luck coming early." The staff member nodded, their voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "I see. Well, the owner is currently occupied at the vet clinic. Let me just—" They trailed off, reaching for a walkie-talkie clipped to their belt. As the staff member called through to the clinic to confirm the owner's position, Shaq found his mind drifting back to the NBA reunion. He couldn't help but feel a pang of regret at the thought of missing even part of it. The chance to reconnect with old teammates, to relive the glory days of his career. It was tempting to just turn around and head straight there. But he had made a commitment here first, and if there was one thing Shaq prided himself on, it was following through on his word. The staff member's voice snapped him back to the present. "All right, Mr. O'Neal. If you'll follow me, I'll lead you through the park to the clinic." As they walked, Shaq took in the quiet morning atmosphere of the zoo. The paths were mostly empty, save for a few early-morning zookeepers going about their duties. In the distance, he could hear the occasional call of an exotic bird or the low rumble of a big cat. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the bustling energy he was used to in his daily life. The staff member, clearly nervous in the presence of the basketball legend, attempted some small talk. "So, have you ever been to our zoo before, Mr. O'Neal?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, first time. Heard good things about it, though." "Oh, yes," the staff member nodded enthusiastically. "We may not be the biggest zoo around, but we take pride in our animal care and conservation efforts." As they walked, Shaq's mind wandered again to the NBA reunion. He wondered who would be there, what stories would be shared. It was rare for so many legends to be in one place at one time. He made a mental note to try and speed things along here if he could. They rounded a corner, and a squat, clinical-looking building came into view. "Here we are," the staff member said, gesturing towards the entrance, "the veterinary clinic." The sterile environment of the veterinary clinic contrasted sharply with the natural outdoor setting of the zoo. As Shaq entered, guided by the staff member, another employee at the reception desk greeted them with a surprised look. The clinic's fluorescent lighting illuminated the professional medical setup, with equipment neatly arranged along the walls. "Mr. O'Neal is here to see Mr. Gallagher," the staff member explained to the receptionist, who nodded and picked up a phone, presumably to alert the owner. Shaq's attention, however, was drawn to a large glass window to their right. Through it, he could see into what appeared to be a treatment room. Inside, a man dressed in a suit, who Shaq assumed must be the zoo owner, and a veterinarian in a white coat were attending to a small primate on an examination table. Shaq found himself moving closer to the window, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. The small chimpanzee lay still as the veterinarian, a young woman, carefully administered an injection. The vulnerability of the tiny primate struck Shaq, and he felt a surge of concern. "Mr. O'Neill." The receptionist's voice barely registered as Shaq continued to watch the procedure. "Mr. O'Neill, I can show you to the waiting area if you'd like." But Shaq remained transfixed, his brow furrowed as he observed the careful movements of the vet and the owner. He couldn't help but wonder about the little chimp's condition, what had brought it to need medical attention. Inside the treatment room, the vet finished administering the injection and looked up, freezing when she noticed Shaq watching through the window. Her eyes widened, and she quickly tapped the owner on the shoulder. The man in the suit turned, his eyebrows raising in surprise as he spotted Shaq. Quickly removing his gloves and washing his hands, the owner made his way out of the treatment room and into the reception area. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, extending his hand. "Martin Gallagher. I wasn't expecting you for another couple of hours." Shaq tore his gaze away from the window to shake Martin's hand. "Yeah, sorry about that. Had a sudden schedule conflict come up. Thought I'd try to move our meeting up if possible." Martin's smile tightened slightly, and he shot a questioning look at his staff. "I see. Well, I'm afraid I wasn't informed of your early arrival. We could have been better prepared." The young receptionist looked nervous. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gallagher. I just received a call from the front desk that Mr. O'Neill was here, but you were in the middle of the treatment, and I didn't want to interrupt." Martin held up a hand, silencing the flustered employee. "It's all right, what's done is done." He turned back to Shaq, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the evident tension. "I apologize for the confusion, Mr. O'Neill. As you can see, we were in the middle of treating one of our animals." Shaq nodded, his eyes drifting back to the window. "Yeah, I saw. Is the little guy okay?" Martin followed Shaq's gaze. "Oh yes, just a routine checkup and vitamin booster. Nothing to worry about. Young primates, much like human children, are more susceptible to illness as their immune systems develop. We take extra precautions with them." Shaq nodded, impressed. "That's good to hear. It's nice to see that you're hands-on with the animal care, not just leaving it to the staff." Martin's smile became more genuine at the compliment. "Thank you. We pride ourselves on our dedication to our animals' well-being. Now shall we step outside? The young one is resting, so it's better to keep it quiet." As they made their way out of the clinic, Shaq felt a whirlwind of emotions. He was deeply impressed by the exceptional care he had witnessed and wanted to learn more. Yet he couldn't help but wish he could speed things up to make it to the reunion event on time. As they stepped out of the clinic into the morning sun, Martin began to elaborate on the zoo's situation. "As you can see, Mr. O'Neill, we take a very hands-on approach to animal care here at Emerald Haven. It's something we're quite proud of." Shaq nodded, his eyes scanning the nearby enclosures. "That's great. I've always been a big believer in personal involvement." Martin's expression turned slightly more serious. "However, I won't lie to you. We do face our fair share of challenges. As a moderate-sized facility, we often struggle to compete with the larger zoos in the state. It's not easy to maintain the level of care we strive for without the resources of bigger institutions." "I can imagine," Shaq replied, his mind already working on potential solutions. "So about our meeting. Any chance we could move it up? I've got this important event later." Martin's refusal came with multiple justifications. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. O'Neill, but I'm afraid that won't be possible. I have scheduled meetings with local reporters, not to mention several pending animal care duties that can't be postponed. I know your time is valuable, but I hope you understand." Despite his celebrity status, Shaq found himself facing a firm, if apologetic, denial. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of frustration, thinking about the NBA reunion he was potentially missing. But he pushed the thought aside, reminding himself of the commitment he'd made. "I understand," Shaq said, trying to keep the disappointment out of his voice. "No worries. I guess I'll just take a look around on my own for a bit, if that's all right." Martin nodded, looking relieved. Absolutely, please take your time to explore. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask our staff. We'll meet at the originally planned time in my office, and I'll have someone escort you there. As Martin hurried off to his other commitments, Shaq found himself alone in the quiet morning atmosphere of the zoo. The park was still relatively empty, with only the occasional school group of preschool children and their teachers breaking the silence. Adjusting his brown tourist hat, Shaq began to make his way through the exhibits. He was grateful for the relative anonymity the early hour and his casual attire provided. It allowed him to observe without drawing attention to himself. As he walked between enclosures, Shaq began to notice some concerning details. While the enclosures themselves appeared well maintained, many of the animals seemed listless and skinny. It was a stark contrast to the image of dedicated animal care that Martin had presented. Shaq frowned, remembering Martin's comments about financial struggles. He recalled reading somewhere about the challenges of zoo business, how they rarely made a profit from visitors alone, and often required government and charity support to stay afloat. The more he saw, the more conflicted Shaq felt. On one hand, he could see the effort being made to care for the animals. On the other, it was clear that the zoo was struggling to provide the level of care the animals truly needed. As he approached the primate section, Shaq stopped by the chimpanzee enclosure. He found himself drawn to the animals within. Several mother chimpanzees were interacting with their young, the familial bonds clearly visible even across species lines. However, as he observed, Shaq became increasingly aware of the space limitations. While the enclosure was well maintained, it was evident that the chimpanzees could benefit from a more expansive area to play and roam. The animals didn't seem overtly stressed, but the need for wider spaces was apparent. Lost in thought, Shaq barely noticed as a new group of preschool students arrived. His thoughts were interrupted by the excited chatter of a new group of preschool students arriving at the chimpanzee enclosure. Their teacher, a man in his early 30s, was trying to corral the excited children. "All right, everyone, let's stay together," the teacher called out. "We're going to learn all about—" The teacher's voice trailed off as his eyes landed on Shaq. For a moment he looked stunned, clearly recognizing the basketball legend despite his attempt at anonymity. But to Shaq's surprise and relief, the teacher quickly composed himself and approached with a respectful, discreet manner. "Excuse me," he said softly, extending his hand. "I'm Travis. I hope I'm not intruding, but I just wanted to say I'm a big fan of yours, Mr. O'Neill. Don't worry, I won't cause a scene or anything. I understand how valuable moments of peace can be." Shaq smiled, shaking Travis's hand. "Thanks, man. I appreciate that. You seem to know a thing or two about needing some quiet time," he added, nodding towards the group of energetic children. Travis chuckled. "Oh, you have no idea, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Say, would you mind if we got a quick photo? I promise I won't post it anywhere. It'd just be for me." "Sure thing," Shaq agreed, impressed by Travis's considerate approach. They posed for a quick selfie, and Shaq even signed Travis's hat at his request. As Travis prepared to rejoin his students, he paused. "Oh, by the way, there's a chimpanzee show starting in about 15 minutes if you're interested. It seems pretty educational. Talks about their intelligence and how similar they are to humans. Might be worth checking out." Shaq nodded, thanking Travis for the information. As the teacher returned to his group, Shaq checked his watch. He still had about an hour before his rescheduled meeting with Martin. The idea of an educational program about chimpanzees appealed to him. He'd always been fascinated by the intelligence of these animals. As he was considering whether to attend the show, his phone rang. Stepping away from the enclosure, he answered the call. It was his friend again, calling for an update on the NBA reunion. "Hey man," Shaq said, his voice tinged with regret. "Looks like I won't be able to make it on time. Couldn't move up the meeting here, but I'll definitely be there even if I'm late, all right?" After ending the call, Shaq made his way towards the showroom. He figured the educational program would be a good way to pass the time, and since most people would be focused on the show, he was less likely to be recognized. As he approached the showroom entrance, he noticed groups of students from at least 3 different schools streaming in. Deciding to wait for the crowds to settle, Shaq hung back, his mind drifting to the little chimpanzee he'd seen in the clinic earlier. He couldn't help but wonder how the young primate was doing now. Lost in thought, Shaq barely noticed as Travis, leading the same group of preschool students, arrived. The teacher he had met earlier spotted Shaq immediately. "Sir," Travis said quietly as he approached, careful not to draw attention from his students or other visitors. "Fancy seeing you here again. Thinking of catching the show?" Shaq nodded, grateful for Travis's continued discretion. "Yeah, thought it might be interesting. You bringing your class in?" Travis grinned. "Absolutely. This is actually the first time our school has brought the students here. I hope they'll enjoy learning about how intelligent chimps are." He paused, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "All right then. I'll get the kids inside. Are you coming in?" Shaq nodded with a small smile. "Sure, but I'll stay in the back row." As they made their way into the showroom, Travis discreetly directed Shaq to a seat in the far back corner. The room was buzzing with excitement, children chattering eagerly while teachers attempted to maintain some semblance of order. Scattered tourists filled the remaining seats, creating a diverse audience for the upcoming show. While waiting for the program to begin, Shaq found himself idly browsing articles on his phone about chimpanzees. His casual research led him to a concerning piece about human respiratory viruses affecting primates and great apes. The article detailed how these viruses could spread from humans to apes, potentially causing serious health issues in zoo populations. Shaq's brow furrowed as he read, his mind drifting back to the young chimpanzee he had seen in the clinic earlier. Could it have been suffering from a similar respiratory issue? He made a mental note to ask Martin about this when they met later. As the lights dimmed and the show began, Shaq put his phone away, focusing his attention on the stage. A zookeeper, a man in his mid-30s with a friendly demeanor, stepped out to address the audience. "Good morning, everyone," the zookeeper called out enthusiastically. "I'm Gregory Mathers, but you can all call me Greg. Welcome to our program, Primate Wonders, A Journey into Intelligence." The educational portion of the show started promisingly, with Greg sharing fascinating facts about chimpanzee behavior and cognitive abilities. However, the tone of the presentation shifted dramatically when Greg brought out a baby chimpanzee. "And now let me introduce you to our star performer, Mello," Greg announced, leading a small chimpanzee onto the stage. Shaq felt a jolt of recognition. The baby chimp bore a striking resemblance to the one he had seen receiving treatment earlier in the clinic. He blinked, trying to get a better look from his position at the back of the room. Surely, he thought, they wouldn't put a sick animal in a show. He tried to convince himself that baby chimpanzees probably all looked similar from a distance, and that his position at the back of the room was making it hard to distinguish individuals. As the show progressed, however, Shaq's unease grew. The educational content began to give way to increasingly concerning performances. Mello, visibly restricted by chains, was compelled to perform various tricks, riding a tricycle, waving to the audience, and balancing on balls. The chimp's reluctance was becoming more apparent with each forced action. As some tourists and children seemed to grow bored, Greg escalated the tricks, introducing elements like hide-and-seek and peekaboo, often surprising the chimpanzee to elicit reactions from the crowd. Shaq watched with growing concern as Mello's movements became slower and more lethargic over time. The animal's eyes seemed to close every few seconds, and its reactions to Greg's surprises became increasingly agitated. As the zookeeper ushered the children forward, explaining how to safely feed the chimpanzees, the group buzzed with excitement. Tiny hands clutched small pieces of fruit and vegetables as they approached the young primate on the presentation table. Shaq stayed at his seat at the back of the event room, his height giving him a clear view over the crowd of eager kids. He watched as Mello posture stiff and its gaze wary. As each child extended a hand with food, Mello would glance at them briefly, then turn its head away. One boy tried again, nudging the fruit closer to its mouth, but Mello let out a soft grunt of annoyance and shifted even further back. Shaq folded his arms, his brow furrowing as he observed the interaction. The hesitation, the clear lack of appetite. It all felt oddly familiar. He watched as Mello glanced briefly at the other chimps before retreating to the far corner of the enclosure, arms crossed in a very human-like gesture of frustration or defiance. Shaq's thoughts began to race. He'd seen this chimp before, he was sure of it now. The clinic. The same intelligent, observant eyes, the same wary demeanor. This wasn't just any chimp. Mello had been under medical care recently. Unable to contain his worry any longer, Shaq stood up, his imposing figure drawing immediate attention even in the dimmed room. "Hey," he called out, his deep voice carrying easily across the showroom. "What's going on here? That chimp looks sick." Greg, startled by the interruption, squinted into the audience. It was clear he didn't recognize Shaq in the dim light. "Sir, please sit down. You're disrupting the show." But Shaq wasn't backing down. "That animal doesn't look well. This isn't right. You have to stop. You're putting the children and the primate at risk here." Greg's face hardened. "I told you to calm down, sir. You are the one making the children and our animals scared." The teachers, Travis included, were all staring at Shaq, but only Travis recognized him. "What are you waiting for? Get the kids and stop that chimp from getting distressed." Greg's anger flared as teachers ushered their students back to their seats. The event descended into chaos. "Security!" he shouted. "We have a disruptive visitor. Please escort him out of the showroom." As security guards approached, chaos erupted in the room. Some children began crying, scared by the sudden commotion. Teachers tried to calm their students, looking confused and uncertain about the situation unfolding before them. Shaq allowed himself to be led out of the showroom, but his mind was racing. Something was very wrong here, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. As Shaq was escorted out of the showroom, he found himself face to face with two burly security guards. Their stern expressions softened slightly as they recognized him, but they maintained their professional demeanor. "Sir," one of the guards said, his voice a mix of respect and authority, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave if you can't enjoy the show quietly. It's meant for children, you know." Shaq opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Martin Gallagher, the zoo owner, strode towards them, his face a mask of concern. He looked at the security guards, then at Shaq, his eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. O'Neill, is everything all right?" The security guards, realizing they had just manhandled a celebrity, looked mortified. "We're so sorry, Mr. O'Neill," one of them stammered. "We didn't realize it was you." Shaq waved off their apologies. "It's not you guys I'm worried about," he said, his voice tight with anger. "It's what's going on in that showroom. That chimp, Mello, something's not right." Martin's face paled slightly. I'm sure it's nothing serious, Mr. O'Neill. Our animals receive the best care possible." "Then explain to me why that baby chimp looks drugged," Shaq pressed, his voice low but intense, "and why it's chained up and being forced to do tricks when it's clearly not feeling well." Martin glanced around nervously, aware of the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. "Perhaps we should discuss this in my office," he suggested, his tone placating. "Away from prying ears." Shaq hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As much as he wanted to storm back into the showroom and stop the show, he knew that a more measured approach might yield better results. He followed Martin towards the administrative building, his mind racing with questions and concerns. The walk to Martin's office was tense and silent. As they entered the room, Martin closed the door behind them and turned to face Shaq, his expression a mixture of concern and defensiveness. "Mr. O'Neill," he began, "I want to assure you that what Greg did in there is completely unacceptable. I had no idea he was using such methods in his shows. I promise you, I will take immediate action against this employee." Shaq studied Martin's face, trying to gauge his sincerity. "It's not just about Greg," he said slowly. "I've been walking around your zoo all morning. The enclosures seem well maintained, but many of the animals look thin and listless. They need more space, better care." Martin's shoulders sagged slightly. "You're right," he admitted. "That's exactly our challenge. Despite my desire to improve their well-being, we're financially limited. We desperately need donor support to make the necessary improvements." Shaq nodded, remembering what he'd read about the financial struggles of zoos. "I get that," he said, "but drugging animals for shows? That's crossing a line, Martin. I can assure you, Mr. O'Neill, that Mello was not drugged, Martin said quickly. As I mentioned earlier, we gave him a vitamin booster, but young chimpanzees are prone to illness, so perhaps he wasn't in the best condition to perform. I promise I will clarify this with the zookeeper to ensure that performing animals are in good health. I hope this incident won't affect your view of our zoo as a whole. We truly need support to continue our work and improve conditions for our animals. Shaq was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his checkbook. "All right," he said. "I'm going to trust you on this, Martin, but I expect better from now on. No more exploitative shows. Focus on education, on teaching people about these amazing animals." Relief washed over Martin's face as Shaq signed the promised check. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. You have no idea how much this means for our animals." As Shaq handed over the check, Martin's expression shifted slightly. "Mr. O'Neill, I hate to ask, but would you mind waiting a bit longer? I've arranged for some press coverage, but they're not here yet because you arrived earlier than scheduled. The exposure would be invaluable for us." Shaq glanced at his watch, acutely aware of the NBA reunion he was missing. "I'm sorry, Martin, but I really need to get going. I have another important meeting to attend." Martin's face fell, but he quickly recovered. "I understand completely. In that case, would you be willing to do a quick photo for our social media? It would mean so much for our exposure." Shaq hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "One quick photo, then I've got to go." Martin's eagerness was palpable as he quickly arranged for a staff member to take a photo of them together. As soon as the picture was taken, Shaq made his way towards the exit, with Martin personally escorting him, repeatedly expressing gratitude for his support. The tension from earlier seemed to have dissipated, replaced by an uneasy truce. "Again, Mr. O'Neill," Martin said, his voice filled with gratitude, "I can't thank you enough for your support, and I want to assure you once more that I'll be addressing the issues you brought up immediately." Shaq nodded, his mind already drifting to the NBA reunion he was now running late for. "I appreciate that, Martin. Just make sure those animals are taken care of, all right?" Shaq climbed into his car, the events of the day weighing heavily on his mind as he started the engine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't quite right, but he had done what he came to do, and now it was time to move on to his next commitment. He hoped that his contribution would make a real difference for the animals, even as a nagging doubt lingered in the back of his mind. "Safe travels, Mr. O'Neill, and thank you once again for everything," Martin said, waving his hands. Shaq rolled down his windows, then reversed his car and drove out of the parking lot. Shaq was driving halfway to the exit when he realized something was missing: his tourist hat. He must have left it behind during the commotion at the showroom. For a moment, he considered leaving it behind. He was already late for the reunion, and going back would only delay him further. But something nagged at him, a feeling that he shouldn't leave things as they were. With a sigh, Shaq turned the car around and headed back towards the main entrance. He parked and retraced his steps towards the showroom, noticing that Martin and his team were no longer at the entrance. As he approached the showroom doorway, he heard voices coming from inside. He recognized Martin's voice immediately, along with Greg's. Instinctively, Shaq slowed his pace, listening. "Can't believe you were so careless," Martin's voice carried clearly, filled with anger. "Do you have any idea what could have happened if the press or animal care agencies had seen those chains?" Greg's voice was defensive. "I'm sorry, sir. I was scared the sedative wouldn't be enough to keep Mello docile. I thought we still need the chains." "That's the problem, Greg. You didn't think enough," Martin snapped. "Next time, increase the dose of ace-promazine. We can't risk another incident like this." Shaq felt his blood run cold. The conversation confirmed his worst suspicions. Not only were they aware of the mistreatment, but they were actively planning to continue it. Unable to contain his anger any longer, Shaq stepped into the doorway, his imposing figure filling the frame. "There won't be a next time," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Martin and Greg whirled around, their faces a mixture of shock and fear as they realized Shaq had overheard everything. "Mr. O'Neill," Martin stammered, his earlier composure completely shattered. I can explain. But Shaq was already pulling out his phone. "Save it," he growled. "I've heard enough. I'm calling the press right now." Shaq made the anonymous phone call and detailed to the press everything he witnessed. Greg lunged forward as if to grab the phone, but Martin held him back. "Don't be hasty, Mr. O'Neill," Martin said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "You have no proof. It's your word against ours. And who do you think the police and press will believe? A respected zoo owner or a basketball player sticking his nose where it doesn't belong?" Shaq paused, his finger hovering over the call button. Martin was right. Without evidence, it would be difficult to prove anything. But he couldn't just walk away, not now that he knew the truth. In that moment of hesitation, Shaq's eyes fell on Mello, still in his cage on the stage. The young chimp looked even more lethargic than before, his eyes barely open. The sight steeled Shaq's resolve. Without a word, he raised his phone and began taking pictures of Mello in his cage, of the chains lying nearby, of Martin and Greg's panicked expressions. "What do you think you're doing?" Greg shouted, moving towards Shaq again. But Shaq was quicker. In that moment, Shaq's years of basketball training kicked in. With a swift, fluid motion, he sidestepped Greg's advance, using his imposing presence to create space between them. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Shaq warned, his voice low but firm, "unless you want to add assault charges to your list of problems." He sidestepped Greg's advance, using his larger frame to keep the zookeeper at bay. "I'm getting evidence," he said firmly, "and I'm making sure these animals get the help they need." As he spoke, Shaq spotted his missing hat behind his former seat. He crouched down to retrieve it, never taking his eyes off Martin and Greg. "You're making a big mistake, O'Neill," Martin threatened, his earlier politeness completely gone. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Shaq straightened up, hat in hand, and fixed Martin with a steely gaze. "No, you're the one who made a mistake. You thought you could get away with this. But it ends now." With that, Shaq turned and walked out of the showroom, leaving Martin and Greg sputtering behind him. As he strode through the zoo, he could hear commotion building. Word of the confrontation must have spread quickly. Navigating through the zoo's back areas, Shaq made his way towards the parking lot, avoiding the gathering crowd near the main entrance. His protective instinct extended beyond just exposing the truth. He was determined to ensure the evidence reached the right hands. As he approached his car, Shaq could see the media frenzy beginning to unfold. News vans were pulling up, their satellite dishes extending skyward. Protesters, likely alerted by social media, were already gathering with hastily made signs. Climbing into his vehicle, Shaq took a moment to catch his breath. He knew this was just the beginning of what promised to be a significant investigation. But as he started the engine and carefully maneuvered out of the parking lot, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than any he'd experienced on the basketball court. The scene behind him transformed from a quiet zoo to the center of a brewing scandal. But Shaq's focus was now on the road ahead, both literally and figuratively. He had evidence to protect, authorities to contact, and most importantly, animals to save. Inside his car, Shaq watched the rapidly unfolding chaos through his rearview mirror. The once quiet zoo entrance now buzzed with activity as animal rights protesters arrived with hastily made signs, their voices carrying across the parking lot. News vans continued to pull in, their satellite dishes extending skyward, a clear indication that this story was about to break wide open. Taking advantage of the momentary privacy in his car, Shaq pulled out his phone once more. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen as he composed a message to his personal assistant, Derek. "Derek," he typed, "I'm sending you some photos and videos. It's urgent. We've got a serious case of animal abuse at Emerald Haven Wildlife Park. I need you to get these to our lawyers and trusted media contacts ASAP. Also, start looking into reputable animal sanctuaries. We're going to need them." He paused for a moment, then added, "And Derek, I want to personally oversee Mello's rescue. He's a young chimp and he needs help fast." As he hit send, attaching the damning evidence he had gathered, Shaq felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Anger at the mistreatment he had witnessed, determination to make things right, and a strange sense of purpose. This wasn't the first time he had involved himself in animal welfare issues, but something about this situation felt different, more urgent. Within seconds, his phone buzzed with Derek's reply, "On it, boss, I'll start making calls right away. But you need to get out of there now. Your car's pretty recognizable, and this story is about to blow up." Shaq looked up, realizing Derek was right. Through his mirrors, he noticed several press teams moving towards his vehicle, their cameras already raised. The distinctive flashes of photography reflected in his rearview mirror, a stark reminder of how quickly things could escalate. Starting the engine, Shaq carefully maneuvered his car towards the exit. As he approached the main gate, he noticed a group of school children being escorted to their buses. Among them, he spotted a familiar face, Travis, the teacher he had met earlier. Shaq slowed his car, rolling down the window. Travis looked up, his eyes meeting Shaq's. In that brief moment, a wordless exchange passed between them. Travis's expression was a mixture of concern and gratitude. He gave Shaq a small, appreciative nod, clearly aware that something significant had transpired, even if he didn't know the details. Shaq returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement of their earlier interaction and the events that had unfolded since. He wanted to say something, to explain, but there was no time. The children were being hurried onto the buses, and the commotion at the zoo was growing. As Travis turned to guide his students, Shaq felt a pang of regret that they couldn't have a proper goodbye or discussion. But he knew that his actions would speak louder than any words he could have shared in that moment. Shaq pulled away from the curb, watching in his rearview mirror as Travis and his students boarded their bus. He knew that leaving the zoo was just the beginning. There would be interviews to give, statements to make, and most importantly, animals to save. The NBA reunion he had been so worried about missing earlier now seemed insignificant in comparison to the task ahead. As he merged onto the main road, leaving the chaos of the zoo behind, Shaq felt a renewed sense of purpose. He may have walked into Emerald Haven as a potential donor, but he was leaving as an advocate, determined to use his platform and resources to make a real difference in the lives of those animals. As he drove, he switched on the car's built-in television. The news was already breaking, and he wanted to stay informed about the developing situation. "Breaking news," the anchor's voice filled the car. "We're receiving reports of alleged animal mistreatment at Emerald Haven Wildlife Park. Sources claim that NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal uncovered evidence of abuse during a visit to the facility." Shaq listened intently as the initial reports focused on the anonymous tips about animal mistreatment and unauthorized drug use. The immediate public backlash was evident, with social media already buzzing with calls for investigation and closure of the zoo. As he navigated through traffic, Shaq's phone rang. The car's Bluetooth system displayed Derek's name. "Boss," Derek's voice came through the speakers, "I've got updates. Our legal team is already drafting statements, and I've reached out to some reputable animal sanctuaries." "Good work, Derek," Shaq replied, his voice filled with determination. "What about Mello? Any word on getting him out of there?" "I've prioritized his case," Derek assured him. "I've got a team of veterinarians and animal welfare experts on standby. As soon as we get the green light from authorities, they'll move in to assess and relocate him." Shaq nodded, even though Derek couldn't see him. "All right, keep me posted. I want to be there when they move Mello. That little guy's been through enough." As he ended the call with Derek, Shaq's mind was already racing ahead, formulating plans for the animal's future. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long process, but he was committed to seeing it through. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his friend calling about the NBA Legends reunion. "Hey, big man," his friend's voice came through, a mix of concern and curiosity. "We saw the news. What's going on? Are you still coming?" Shaq sighed, feeling a pang of regret for missing the gathering, but knowing he had made the right choice. "I'm on my way, but I'm going to be late. You wouldn't believe the day I've had." "We saw something on TV about a zoo?" his friend prompted. "Yeah," Shaq replied, his voice growing serious. "I stumbled onto something big. Animal abuse, man. Couldn't just walk away from it." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Damn," his friend finally said. "That's heavy. But you did the right thing, Shaq. We're proud of you." Shaq felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Thanks, man, that means a lot. Look, I'll be there as soon as I can, and trust me, I've got one hell of a story to tell when I arrive. As he ended the call, Shaq couldn't help but reflect on how differently this day had turned out from what he had planned. He had woken up this morning worried about balancing a zoo visit with an NBA reunion. Now he found himself at the center of an animal welfare investigation that could potentially change the lives of countless creatures. The road stretched out before him, leading not just to the reunion of old friends and teammates, but to a new chapter in his life. Shaq realized that this unexpected detour might just lead to his most meaningful contribution yet, not on the basketball court or in business, but in protecting vulnerable animals from exploitation. As he drove on, the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, but it was a weight he was more than willing to bear. The NBA Legends reunion would wait. Right now, he had a more pressing engagement, with a young chimpanzee named Mello and all the other animals who needed his help. Shaq smiled to himself, feeling a sense of purpose stronger than any he had experienced in years. This was just the beginning, he thought, and he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.